All right, so what I want to do in this lecture is we're going to, talk about probably one of the most interesting centuries in all of history. I'm going to mention three results that come primarily as results of the Crusades. And this most interesting period and century in history is the 14th. Barbara Tuchman, who's written a book on this century, has called the 14th century the very nearly the undoing of Christendom. The horrors of the age were of apocalyptic proportions, so that doomsayers were not at all unjustified in their predictions of the very near and certain end of the world. All of this, though, harkens back to the effects of the Crusades. So last time, I said that the First Crusade was successful in recapturing Jerusalem in 1097, and yet the Crusades continued for the next 300 years or so. Right, and I mentioned, right, this occurred because of constant fighting, a constant conflict with Islam. And what I wanted to do before we move into the 14th century is just break down very briefly the 8 primary crusades that we see in and through the period. So, first, nope, not this. First is the First Crusade. Okay. This takes place from 1096 to 1099. Okay. And this is where we have the recovery of the Christian East. This crusade did, in fact, liberate Jerusalem and established several kingdoms, which we call today and remember as the Crusader kingdoms. These include Edessa, Antioch, Cilicia, Tripoli, Cyprus, Acre, and Jerusalem. As I mentioned last time, they set up Western lords and kings. They set up feudal systems. They built castles. They rebuilt cathedrals, churches. And so they set up really Western, even Roman kingdoms in the East. However, that didn't last long. And this led to a second crusade, the Second Crusade, which took place from 1145 to 1148. Here we have the failure at Edessa and Damascus. So after the First Crusade, battles continued, and this led to a Second Crusade, where we see the warfare between the Crusaders on this crusade led to defeat and failure. This then led to a Third Crusade, 1178 to 1191. In this crusade, we see primarily two figures, Richard I and Saladin. Richard the First, or Richard the Lionheart. This crusade is the backdrop for the great story of Robin Hood. Prince John has to step in as his brother is away on the Third Crusade, right, and really works to destroy England in and through his incompetence. But this Third Crusade had limited success in reestablishing some of these kingdoms that were established. However, they failed to regain Jerusalem. The story of this crusade, as I said, is largely the conflict between two figures, Richard and Saladin. Also, during the Third Crusade, we have the introduction of the Templars, who came into their own and into great renown during this crusade. Okay, this then leads us to the Fourth Crusade, the crusade which set the Great Schism in stone. This occurred from 1198 to 1204, where the Crusaders don't even make it to the Crusader kingdoms in defense, but they instead go and sack Constantinople. So in the Third Crusade, Saladin had recaptured the kingdom of Edessa and Antioch after Jerusalem was resacked. The effort was to recapture this land, and yet, right, as I said, after getting suspicious of Eastern Christians, they decided it would be a better use of their time to go and sack the great city of the Eastern Church. Years later, this brings us then to the Fifth Crusade. And this takes place from 1217 to 1221. And here we have Francis of Assisi in Egypt. The goal of this crusade was to get to Jerusalem a different way. The usual way from the west to the east had really just been overused, and right each time, right after 4 crusades, the Muslim Turks knew exactly the way in which the Crusaders were going to come. So they decided to try to get to Jerusalem by way of Egypt. They didn't meet their objective, however. Francis, though, went on this crusade and went and preached to Muslims in Egypt. The great monk and reformer of monastic life in this period was not merely concerned to preach to the birds, but he instead went and preached to anyone who would listen. In the Sixth Crusade, this took place in 1228 to 1227, or 1229. Following an attempted crusade, Frederick and Gregory stopped feuding long enough to secure peace with the saccharins. So in and through this period, we have an interesting political climate because we have kings and their subjects often going off to crusade. In this sixth crusade, there are really two kings, Frederick and Gregory, who kind of image this for us. So as a king would go off to war, the Pope had declared anyone who seeks to sack their city would be excommunicated from the church. So that was a good way to kind of stop feuds from continuing in and through different kingdoms. And so this sixth crusade, as it took place, ended up there were two rival kings that went off to crusade, and they decided to be able to make peace together as a result. That's kind of the highlight of the sixth crusade. The seventh crusade features a king who, this is Frederick and Gregory. The seventh crusade features a king whom a city in Missouri is named after, St. Louis. Here, St. Louis is remembered for rebuilding Palestine, 1248 through 1254. Okay, and then finally the eighth crusade ends in the death of St. Louis and the renunciation of all Frankish land claims in the east. So this takes place from 1267 to 1272. This is looked at as like the failure of St. Louis. Which then effectively ends the Crusader kingdoms and thus the Crusades officially. This then brings us to the calamitous 14th century. Well, as a result of the Crusades, we have really three primary effects. Three primary effects that occur in the next generation. Okay? Though the Crusades are officially ended, we still have people going back and forth, seeking to be a hero and make some semblance of a dent in battle against the Muslims who continued to remain in the East. Well, the first event that occurs in the 14th century of note is the Black Plague. This takes place from 1347 to 1352. Then we will talk about the 100 Years' War, the war between France and England. Which lasts just, over 100 years. So it's 1337 to 1453. Okay, and then third, we're going to talk about the Avignon Papacy. This takes place from 1305 to 1417. So let's start then with the Black Plague. I'm sure you're somewhat familiar with this. But what we have here is a series of plagues, and really actually 3 different series of contagions that are all closely related. They came in waves, and wave after wave, as tens of thousands of people began to perish. But the bubonic plague initially was thought to be carried by fleas. We know now that they had picked up the contagion from rats that were carried on trading ships throughout the Mediterranean and Atlantic worlds, and especially as they were returning after Crusades. During the Black Death, there were whole sections of the world that perished. All 3 plagues, as they came together, turned the extremities black, caused large boils, brought bronchitis, and then pneumonia. It killed nearly everyone who contracted it within 4 days. In places, the plague wiped out entire cities without a single soul surviving. Sometimes it seemed to follow highways, and sometimes it seemed to completely skip a city. When a city was afflicted, there was no one who could tend to the sick or bury the dead. This created widespread panic and social disruption as people fled for their lives, often carrying the plague with them. Completely collapsed the inheritance systems and the feudal order, claiming between 25 and 75 million people from China to Iceland. Thus, it is understood that it wiped out at least 1/3 to probably more like 1/2 of the population of Europe, Asia, and Africa at the time. Some historians estimate it's 60%. With no treatments, it was assumed that the 4 angels of the apocalypse had come and that there was no future. Well, if you don't believe that there's a future and you've escaped from the plague, what do? Well, you squander your resources in pleasure rather than investing in continuing in work. Soon, as a result of the Black Plague and the number of deaths, the economy began to collapse. Law enforcement, kings, landlords all disappeared. So then thievery, licentiousness, and the breakdown of any sense of law and order arose. At the same time, it was even impacting the Muslims and the people of China. To the medieval man, it had seemed as if the hand of God's judgment had come and there was no hope for the future. But that's not all. And through this period of Black Plague, we also have the 100 Years' War that takes place. So while the plague was going on, there began a fight to the death between France and England. This war is known as the 100 Years' War, which was fought between 1337 and 1453. This began when William the Conqueror was a prince in Normandy, France. There were regular squabbles between the French and the English in this time. So when we often think of these 2 kingdoms, we think of, okay, the English over here on England or on Britain, and then France is this country, this big country, tied to the rest of the continent. Well, no, in the Middle Ages, most of England's kingdom and most of England's people were on the continent. They were within the boundaries of what we now see as France. So often we have the French and the English living side by side. And so William the Conqueror, a prince of Normandy, um, uh, sought to cross the English Channel and claim England for France. All the while, the English held land in France, as I mentioned, and so this led to the butting of heads. The whole history of this is very fascinating. It starts with the Plantagenets, and I mean the series of kings is really fascinating. It's if you want some drama, you can read some drama. So, in short, this then led to conflict with King Edward II of England, who's also known as Longshanks. The King of France then died with no heir, and Edward II was the closest heir according to French law, as no female could claim the throne. So, as a result, a distant cousin claimed the crown against the claim of Edward Longshanks. So then Edward believed that he was obliged to fight for his right to be King of France. So, right, there's essentially drama within the family line of the king, as there often was, right? Who is supposed to be the next heir? So then this led to war. The battles of Crécy, Agincourt, and Poitiers produced stunning English victories. Shakespeare writes about much of this period in and through his speeches. For example, we see in Henry V, Henry delivers the St. Crispin's Day speech, this famous speech which memorializes one of the battles of the 100 Years' War. In and through the fighting, the French had the advantage. This is because they had the finest knights in the world. And yet they were met with some unique innovations and circumstances which made it difficult to adapt. And they instead believed that it was luck on the part of the British, when it was really that they were outgunned. However, the same miscalculation and pride befell the English when Joan of Arc took the field and led the French to victory at the Battle of Orleans. Some of the technologies that developed in this time were things such as the longbow by the English. That's really what kept the English in the war. Overall, the 100 Years' War gives us some insight and some great stories, like those of William Wallace, of the Black Prince of Henry V, Joan of Arc, and the rivalries such as the War of the Roses, which brought more devastation upon the medieval world. So we have the Black Plague and we have the 100 Years' War going on in the 14th century, and yet that's not all. The final major event that occurs in the 14th century that really leads us to the Reformation is what's called the Babylonian captivity of the church, or the Avignon papacy, which this takes place from the years 1305 to 1417. So the reason why it's called the Avignon papacy, or the Babylonian captivity of the church, is because during this 112 years, the papacy was moved from Rome to the French city of Avignon. The church was full of schism and corruption and abject wickedness. On top of that, right, the papacy had really taken a beating in and through the Crusades, as Western Christians continued to seek to fight to redeem and recapture the Holy Land, and yet were unable time after time after time. All of this began, though, with Pope Boniface VII, who was elected to the papacy in 1294. So, major player in the Avignon papacy. It all begins with Boniface VII. And he became pope in 1294. While he found the papacy at the height of its power, he died, leaving it humbled and in subjection to France. While he sought to rule in the proud and dominating spirit of previous popes like Gregory VII or Innocent III, he was arrogant without being strong, and he was bold without being wise. Dante visited Rome during the rule of Boniface and pronounces him the prince of modern Pharisees and a usurper who turned Vatican Hill into a common sewer of corruption. In his epic poem, The Divine Comedy, the poet assigned him to one of the lowest circles of hell. We'll read of that now. I was going to bring him up later, but why not? If you have not read The Divine Comedy, I would encourage you to do so. It is amazing. So we see in the eighth circle of hell, so there are 9 circles in the eighth circle. This is what Dante writes to a number of popes. This is found in Canto 19. O Simon Magnus, O you wretched crew who follow him, pandering for silver and gold to the things of God, which should be wedded to love and righteousness. O thieves for hire, now must the trump of judgment sound your doom, here in the third fosse of the rim of fire. So he describes going kind of down into this next circle of hell. And there he sees a group of people who are essentially receiving an inverted baptism. So instead of being immersed, from bottom to top, they're placed head down in a baptism of fire, essentially. So this is his imaginative view of the punishment that the popes would receive. He goes into describe Boniface, and he goes on to speak to him. Let me find it here. There it is. So he says, "Are you there already, Boniface? Are you there already? By several years the writ has lied, and all the gold and all that care. Are you already stated with the treasure for which you dared to turn on the sweet lady and trick and pluck and bleed her at your pleasure?" So now he continues and he says, this is Boniface. He says, "What do you want of me then, if to know who I am drives you so fearfully that you descend to the bank to ask it? Know that the great mantle was once hung upon me, and of truth I am the son of the she-bear." So what he's saying there is he's the son of the bears who killed who Elijah called upon to kill the young boys. Essentially, he's saying, "I'm one who killed the innocent. So sly and eager to push my whelps ahead, that I pursued wealth above and myself here. Beneath my head are all dragged all who have gone before me in buying and selling holy office. There they cower in fissures of stone. I too shall be plunged down when the great cheat for whom I took you comes here into his turn. Longer already have I baked my feet and planted upside down, that he shall be before the west sends down a lawless shepherd of uglier deeds to cover him and me. Speaking there of Satan. And then Dante responds to him. He says, maybe I cannot say I grew too brash at this point. For when he had finished speaking, I said, indeed. Now tell me how much cash our Lord required of Peter in guarantee before he put the keys into his keeping. Surely he asked nothing but follow me. Nor did Peter nor the others ask silver or gold of Matthias when they chose him for the place the despicable and damned apostle sold. Therefore stay as you are, this hole fits you well, and keep a good guard on the ill-worn wealth, the one that once made you so bold towards Charles of Anjou. And were it not that I am still constrained by the reverence I owe the great keys you had held in life, I should not have refrained from using other words, and sharper still, for this avarice of yours grieves all the world, and tramples the virtuous, and exalts the evil. So that gives you a little bit of a picture into Dante's view of Boniface. So, contemporaries of Boniface, additional contemporaries of Boniface, described his reign with this description. They said, he came in like a fox, he reigned like a lion, and he died like a dog. Boniface VII was widely regarded further during this time as being the Antichrist, the picture of absolute wickedness in the highest of places. When Boniface issued his papal bull Unum Sanctum, which we're going to read here in a bit, there was a widespread belief that he was attempting to take over the world and that this was the end of the world. Corruption, benefices, and indulgences were all used as political tools to advance power and control. The overshadowing event, however, of Boniface's reign was his disastrous conflict with Philip the Fair of France. This conflict between the two originated in questions that connected back to the 100 Years' War. As Philip, the King of France, levied taxes upon the French clergy in order to pay for his war with England. Boniface offered a cease and desist order. And he offered to act as umpire between France and England. In all of this, Boniface sought the submission of the kings under his rule, and yet Philip would not submit. And he argued that the Pope had no authority over these matters. In response, Boniface called a council in Rome, and he issued 2 papal bulls. The second of those is the one most notable of all papal documents. This is entitled Unum Sanctum. So we're going to read this. And this really gives us a good picture into the papacy at the height of its corruption. We'll see very clearly how he responds in the year 1302. And I pulled this off of the Roman Catholics Catechism and Papal Documents website. So here we go. Boniface writes, urged by faith, we are obliged to believe and to maintain that the Church is one, holy, Catholic, and also apostolic. We believe in her firmly, and we confess with simplicity that outside of her there is neither salvation nor the remission of sins. As the spouse in the Canticles, Song of Songs 6:8 proclaims, one is my dove, my perfect one. She is the only one, the chosen of her who bore her. And she represents one sole mystical body whose head is Christ, and the head of Christ is God. In her, then, is one Lord, one faith, one baptism. There has been, at the time of the deluge, only one ark of Noah, prefiguring the one church, which ark, having been furnished to a single cubit, had only one pilot and guide, Noah. And we read that outside of the ark, all that subsisted on the earth were destroyed. We venerate this church as one, the Lord having said by the mouth of the prophet, "Deliver, O God, my soul from the sword, and my only one from the hand of the dog," in Psalm 21:20. He has prayed for his soul, that is, for himself, heart and body, and this body, that is to say, the church. He has called one because of the unity of the spouse, of the faith, of the sacraments, and of the charity of the church. This is the tunic of the Lord, the seamless tunic, which was not rent, but which was only cast by lot. Therefore, of the one and only church, there is one body and one head, not two heads, like a monster, that is, Christ and the vicar of Christ, Peter and the successor of Peter. Since the Lord, speaking to Peter himself, said, "Feed my sheep," meaning my sheep in general, not these, nor those in particular, once we understand that he entrusted all to him, Peter. Therefore, if the Greeks or others should say that they are not confided to Peter and to his successors, they must confess not being the sheep of Christ, since our Lord says in John, "There is one sheepfold and one shepherd." We are informed by texts of the Gospels that in the church and its power are two swords, namely the spiritual and the temporal. For when the apostles say, "Behold, here are the two swords," Luke 22:38, that is to say, in the church, since the apostles were speaking, the Lord did not reply that there were too many, but sufficient. Certainly the one who denies that the temporal sword is in the power of Peter has not listened well to the word of the Lord commanding, "Put up thy sword into the scabbard," Matthew 26:52. Therefore, both are in the power of the church, namely the spiritual sword and the material. But indeed, the latter is to be exercised on behalf of the church, and truly the former is to be exercised by the church. The former is of the priest, and the latter is in the hand of kings and soldiers, but at the will and sufferance of the priest. However, one sword ought to be subordinated to the other, and temporal authority subjected to spiritual power. For since the apostle said, "There is no power except from God, and the things that are ordained of God." But they would not be ordained if one sword were not subordinated to the other, and if the inferior one, as it were not led upwards by the other. So if you're tracking so far, right, he's saying that in the papacy, right, that he holds the power over spiritual and temporal matters. That he holds power over both swords, both the sword of the Spirit and the sword of kings. Continues. For according to blessed Dionysius, it is a law of the divinity of the lowest things that the lowest things reach the highest place by intermediaries. Then, according to the order of the universe, all things are not led back to order equally and immediately, but the lowest by the intermediary and the inferior by the superior. Hence, we must recognize the more clearly that spiritual power surpasses in dignity and in nobility any temporal power whatever, as spiritual things surpass the temporal. This we see very clearly also by the payment, benediction, and consecration of the tithes, but the acceptance of power itself, and by government even things. For with truth as our witness, it belongs to spiritual power to establish the terrestrial power and to pass judgment if it has not been good. Thus is accomplished the prophecy of Jeremiah concerning the church and the ecclesiastical power. "Behold, today I have placed you over nations and over kingdoms," and the rest. Therefore, if the terrestrial power err, it will be judged by the spiritual power. But if a minor spiritual power err, it will be judged by a superior spiritual power. But if the highest power of all err, it can be judged only by God, and not by man, according to the testimony of the apostle. "The spiritual man judgeth of all things, and he himself is judged by no man." This authority, however, though it has been given to man and is exercised by man, is not human but rather divine, granted to Peter by a divine word, and reaffirmed to him, Peter, and his successors by the one whom Peter confessed, the Lord, saying to Peter himself, "Whatsoever you shall bind on earth shall be bound also in heaven." Matthew 16:19. Therefore, whoever resists this power thus ordained by God resists the ordinance of God, unless he invent, like Manichaeus, two beginnings, which is false and judged by us heretical, since according to the testimony of Moses, it is not beginnings but the beginning that God created heaven and earth. Furthermore, we declare, we proclaim, and we define that it is absolutely necessary for salvation that every human creature be subject to the Roman pontiff. So, right, his response to Philip is that you are out of line, right, and are not submitting to me, to whom you must be subject to if you want to be saved. So how did the French respond to this? Well, they responded strongly. They defended the king and the French rights against Boniface, and they attacked his right to the papal throne. They questioned whether he was true pope. But that was not all. This has happened a number of times through the history of the Catholic Church. So this is nothing new, but it is exciting. On September 7th, 1303, about 300 mercenaries came and entered the palace of the Pope. There they demanded that he resign papal office. The palaces were then looted, and the cathedral was burned, and numerous religious relics were destroyed. The Pope and his nephews were held captive for 3 days until he was rescued. A month later, however, he was dead. The humiliation of Boniface the Seventh. At the humiliation of Boniface VII, the state gained signal triumph over the papacy. The successor of Boniface was Benedict the 11th, who only reigned for 8 months. Okay, so it's at this point we have all these events lead up to the Avignon papacy. So after 11 months of conflict with the death of Benedict the 11th, the French gained a triumph with the election of one of their own bishops, Clement V. At the time of his election, he was in France and he never crossed the Alps. Thus began the so-called Babylonian captivity, or the Avignon papacy, which lasted for more than 70 years and included 7 popes. Well, as Clement V is elected, there's a council that is very quickly assembled to attempt to put an end to this issue by electing a different pope. So now there are 2 popes. And then very quickly there are then 3 popes, all vying for preeminence. Schisms were happening everywhere. There were multiple rival popes elected by rival cardinal colleges, and at one time there were 8 popes, all claiming to be pope. And so monarchs then had to decide which pope that they would declare their allegiance to. And then other popes would excommunicate the monarch, and then the monarch who was excommunicated by the other popes, his pope would then excommunicate the other popes. So it made a mockery of the church. And during this period, it lost all credibility and what little credibility it had. The Avignon papacy did not end until 1417 with the Council of Constance. And we're going to look at this next hour in connection with the Renaissance. But all of these events come as ultimately as the result of the effects of the Crusades, and brought about the rather tumultuous, treacherous 14th century. This century would be instrumental in preparing the way for the coming of Reformation in the future generations. Would make the Reformation inevitable. So that is this period of unrest in tumultuous 14th century. Questions on any of that? All right. Well, we will take a brief break and then we'll pick up with the Renaissance.